Okay, so today we're going to be testing out lecturing in this format where I'm standing up, where I have a whiteboard behind me. That might be a little bit hard to read, but we can use it to draw pictures if we need. And I'll be using an app on my phone to advance slides. This. Okay, there we go. See, you can experience what it's like to actually be a student in one of my lectures because you can see me have to work through some technical issues. So today's practice lecture is going to be about this idea called the evolutionary perspective. And really this lecture is about how evolutionary scientists approach problems. And I realize I don't have my mic in. Let's go ahead. So I'm using an AirPod mic because this is the nicest microphone that I own, and I don't feel like buying another one. I bought one and it doesn't work, which is great. So anywho, we're trying out a bunch of new tech. We'll see how it works. But I am really excited for these lectures because this is basically setting the stage for how scientists think about evolution and how we think about the natural world. And this is going to culminate in what we call the evolutionary perspective, which is the way that we, as scientists who think about life, approach problems in the natural world. So the Earth hosts a vast diversity of living things, right? Like I am a living thing, you are a living thing, right? We are all alive and we're part of this enormous diversity of living things that includes animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, all sorts of things, and of course, human beings like myself. This is, of course, a younger version of myself before grad school when I gained some weight. And we human beings are one small part of this living system, which was formally described by Linnaeus in 1758. We will actually meet Linnaeus in a future lecture on the history of evolutionary thought. But today, it's really just important because we have to center ourselves in the fact that we are part of this enormous living diversity on Earth, right? And our goal is to understand who we are and where we come from, right? That's really the whole goal of science is to understand our position within living things in general. And so evolutionary biology is a scientific discipline, right? And we're going to learn today about what a scientific discipline is, how it works, how it's different from other ways of knowing. But really, evolutionary biology and the evolutionary perspective is a way of approaching biological diversity. Everything about evolutionary biology is about living things, it's about biology and how we came to be, how living things came to be, and how things are how we expect things to change, essentially. So again, evolutionary biology is a scientific discipline, and I think it's really important to take some time to explain what science is. My goal for this course is for this to give students a really strong foundation as scientists. Like this is how they as scientists and you as a scientist and me as a scientist or people who are just scientifically informed, even if you're not a professional research scientist, right, can approach problems in the natural world. There's this tendency in our society to treat science as simply a body of facts, right? That science is like this vast library, this vast storehouse of knowledge, right? And a scientist is somebody who knows many things, right? The scientist is someone who has a great memory, who can recite everything about everything, right? What you're going to learn today is that's not, it's there is a part of science that is gathering facts, but there's also a major part of science that is a process and a discipline of how we approach the natural world and how we solve problems. And I think that's where science is most useful, especially in this day and age, right? 100 years ago, somebody who's been to all the libraries and memorized everything is very useful, right? Because you would have to go find the actual physical book that someone wrote something down in if you wanted to know something. But today, right, I can ask my phone if I wanted to look up anything I want without even having to look it up, right? I could say, "Hey Siri, what's the boiling point of water?" The boiling point of water is 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Thank you, Siri, right? I didn't have that memorized, but I don't need to have it memorized, right? So we're going to move from thinking of science and scientists and scientific knowledge as memorizing a bunch of things to a process and a discipline of how we approach the natural world. And so in science, we're not just trying to memorize things, but we're trying to understand how things work, right? What is a volcanic eruption? How does it work, right? These are scientific questions, not just memorizing that this is what a volcanic eruption is and here's where all of them have happened in the past and la 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 la. Like computers are great at that, right? Scientists have to take the next step, which is thinking about how things work, right? And understanding the processes that underlie the natural world. So, the simplest explanation of science is that science and scientists is an attempt to explain the world, to explain nature in nature's terms, or to explain natural phenomena in natural terms. What that means is that we have this natural world that we can observe, and we scientists are trying to explain that world in its own terms, right? So, not magic, not anything else, right? But things that we can observe, things that are in nature. This does not mean that things don't exist outside of nature, right? I'm not trying to make that argument for you. I'm not trying to make a personal or religious argument. What this means is that science is limited to nature, right? And we're going to see why that's important. So science as a discipline, you can believe or not believe on your own whether things exist outside of nature. I have my own personal beliefs, which I will not share. But science, science being limited to nature doesn't mean that things exist outside of nature or things don't exist outside of nature. It just means that science is limited to the natural world. So science can only address observations in nature. It can't address things outside of nature. It can't address things as a voluntary constraint, right? And you get problems when people exit that constraint. And we'll talk about why that is. But for the purposes of this class, science is the trying to explain nature in nature's terms, right? So, science and religion, which is one of the most common ways people deal with things outside of nature, right, are not actually at odds in reality, right? The problem comes when science tries to explain things in religion, i.e., things outside of nature, or religion tries to explain things in nature. Again, not trying to tell you how you should live your life, but science is necessarily restricted to natural phenomena in terms of nature. So, defining science, right? Scientists formulate and test explanations of natural phenomena. This is really where we get to the discipline of science, right? Scientists are people who are trying to explain things in nature, right? And they have to test those observations, right? And this is where we get into all these facts, right? Like scientists have lots of facts, lots of things written down, right? Just out of screen here, I have a bunch of books and binders of papers in them, right? Those are things that have been collected and recorded by scientists in the past, right? These are observations of nature, which are very important, right? Because those observations of nature are how we test our explanations, right? Does our explanation match what we actually observe in nature? That is the key question for scientists. So the explanatory principle, the thing you say, this is how I think nature works, needs to be consistent with what you actually observe when you go into nature, right? That's the idea. So you say, okay, I think nature works this way. Then you go out into nature and you make observations, right? You say, I think X. And if that is true, then I should observe Y. You go out and you see, do I actually observe it? Or do I get something completely unexpected? Right? That is the process of science. And science is always subject to continued testing. Right? There are some scientific ideas and explanations that are so well supported that they are essentially right truth, but no science ever actually gets beyond being able to be tested or something we'll learn about falsified, right? So ideally, good science communication would be as far as we know, the evidence that we have, right? Science is never fully settled. So, attributes of science, scientific knowledge, scientists, scientific disciplines. Science is testable, repeatable, and falsifiable. We'll talk about what each of these things means. They're all very, very important. So, fundamentally, a scientific understanding, scientific ideas, scientific knowledge are subject to tests. And what this means is that a scientific idea has to be able to be tested, right? So, what scientists are doing, and most of the time, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, I have this idea about how the world works, and I'm going to test it, right? If you can't test an idea, it's not science, right? So hypotheses are tested by comparison of your results, your observations of nature with your predictions. And there's this misconception that historical sciences, like when you're studying the history of things, are not testable. That is actually incorrect, right? You have an idea about how the world worked in the past. You make observations indirectly of the past and see how those observations match your predictions, right? That's still a test, even if it's not a laboratory experiment, right? So this doesn't mean that science is only in the laboratory. That's actually not true. But it means that a scientific idea has to be testable, right? You have to be able to test it, essentially. If you can't test an idea, it's not science. It doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that it's not science and it can't be tested via the scientific method. And remember, a hypothesis in science can never be fully proven. It can be supported, it can have a lot of support, but it can really only be rejected or supported, right? There is this idea of the philosophical truth, right? Like something is true. You never really get to that in science, right? You can get really darn close, right? Like I would predict that if I drop my ID, that it will fall down because of gravity. Let's see. It fell, right? My prediction was correct. And I can say that that's probably because of gravity, right? But I can never 100% fully prove that all the time, everywhere, all at once in the universe, right? Hard to do. That's not, science is never fully proven. It is just supported or rejected. Really important thing about science is not just that it can be tested, but that you can repeat your observation, right? So the idea is, right, you have to be able, let's say you go out, you make an observation, right? You record it, you publish it, great. Ideally, someone should be able to repeat what you did, right? This is why a lot of scientific papers have very heavy, what are called methods sections or materials and methods, which is where someone describes in great detail, right? I did this. I went to this place and I looked at this thing with this camera, right? All these different methods, especially in the experimental sciences, right? Lots of methods. Like I had this test under this conditions, right? With this machine at this day at this time, right? It's important so that people can repeat your observation, right? They can go and have the same set of circumstances and say, do I see the same thing or not, right? And if an observation can be verified, if it can be repeated multiple times, that lends more support. One of my grandfather's favorite phrases, apparently, was the idea that a broken clock is right once a day. Now, if you're a Zoomer like me or even Gen Alpha watching this, you might not know what an analog clock is. An analog clock is this circle with the hands, right, that go around. There's one hand for the hours, one hand for the minutes, right? And these move and tell you what time it is. Now, I know digital clocks today, when they break, they just turn off, right? So this is what's called a dying kind of analogy, if you will. But I have just drawn a clock here, right? At some point, let's say this is the hour hand and this is the minute hand, right? So this would be what? 12, let's say 12:10, right? At some point today, it's going to be 12:10, right? That doesn't mean that the clock I've drawn here is correct. This is not a working clock, right? This is just a circle with some lines that I drew on this whiteboard. Just because you could walk in here at exactly the right time, and this would give you the right time, doesn't mean that this is a reliable method for telling the time, right? It seems silly, but this is the basic principle, right? That you can randomly get the right answer the wrong way, right? Now you might wonder, well, why do we care, right? This told me the right time. I should use this as the clock, right? The problem is you come in at any other time, this is wrong, right? You come in at 12:11, this is wrong. You come in at 5 a.m., this is wrong, right? So what we want in science are ideas and explanations that serve society, right? That allow you to make predictions. I want you to be able to tell the time correctly, right? So it's important that you can verify observations that can be made repeatedly, essentially so you can rule out the possibility that you're working with a broken clock, right? That's the idea. That's why it's so important that scientific observations can be repeated. Now, this is one a lot of people forget about, but it's subtle, but it's really important. You have to be able to falsify a scientific idea. What this means is that for an idea to be scientific, you have to be able to prove it's wrong. So things like opinion, right? If I say I think chocolate ice cream tastes better than vanilla ice cream, in real life, I'm not quite sure. It depends on the context. But let's just say I said I think chocolate ice cream tastes better. That's not a scientific hypothesis, right? You can't prove my subjective sense of taste, right? Other people have different senses of taste, right? At different ages. Like I like chocolate ice cream more when I was a kid. I like vanilla ice cream more now. They're both great, right? But it's subjective. If you say chocolate ice cream is healthier than vanilla because it has more antioxidants, now here's a little bit more scientific, right? There's things in here you could falsify. It's possible you could prove maybe vanilla ice cream has more antioxidants than chocolate, right? Maybe antioxidants aren't super healthy, right? I'm not a health scientist, right? But the point is, in that example two here, you can disprove one of these ideas, the other one you can't, right? So a scientific idea has to be falsifiable, right? So for something to be science, it has to be testable, repeatable, falsifiable. Now, we've touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to make sure we get to this, right? Science has a methodological naturalism, which is a long way of saying that science limits itself to nature. Philosophical naturalism is the idea that nothing exists outside of nature, right? That is a philosophical idea. You can choose to believe that or not, right? I personally don't, if I'm being honest. So science has a voluntary constraint to address nature in terms of nature, right? Remember, science is a discipline. We scientists are a group of people who, by and large, are trying to serve our society, right? We want to understand the natural world, educate people in the natural world, help people solve problems, deal with nature, right? Have happier, healthier, longer, more productive lives, right? That's what we want, right? So we're focused on nature again, because if we don't, then we lose the explanatory power of science, right? Let's say you stray outside of naturalism, right? You stray outside and you say, well, I'm going to explain something in terms of magic, right? Or I'm going to explain something, I'm going to have ideas that can't be falsified, right? Or can't be tested, right? Just trust me, right? That type of thing. The problem then becomes you have no way of knowing if that thing is actually correct or useful or not, right? That's the problem. So we scientists, again, this is a voluntary constriction of science to nature on nature's terms. Okay, so this is kind of these are really old memes passed down to me, right? But I like them just because it's like blast from the. I'm a paleontologist by trade, so I love fossil. These are fossil memes, is what I would call them, right? But essentially, right, we scientists, right, follow something. You may have heard of this, right, called the scientific method, right? The scientific method is repeated a lot, but it is important, right? Because in general, scientists follow a research strategy that is repeatable, right? So that we can test ideas in a repeatable way, right? So in science, typically, right, we're focused on observation and hypothesis. These are the common currency of science and scientists, right? So advancement happens in science when multiple scientists, many scientists, can use the same process to discover and or to discover information, right? It's helpful to have the same process when we're working across. Remember, scientists are working across different languages, different regions, even different centuries, right? I might read a paper that was written by someone 100 years ago. Having a similar process helps me understand what that person did and why they did it, right? And essentially, the basic part of science, right? We can have this long, complicated scientific method, but really what happens is that scientists build hypotheses, which are explanations of the natural world, to try to explain observations, right? We make observations of the natural world. We try to explain those observations with a hypothesis. The next and really important step here, right, is we have to test that hypothesis, right? Some hypotheses are easier to test than others. Different sciences test hypotheses in different ways, but fundamentally, we have an idea about how the world works, and we try to go out into the natural world. Sometimes that's an experiment, sometimes that's collecting fossils, sometimes that's making up, making a model, right? Not making things up, making a model, right? To try to understand how the natural world works, right? And in general, we usually have multiple hypotheses, right? We have different explanations for how the natural world works, and we pick the one that best explains our observations, right, on the evidence we have today. Remember, right, hypothesis is never proven. It is either supported or rejected, right? And as any science advances, your hypotheses get more nuanced. They're subject to more testing, right? They're based on more information, and they get better and better, but they are never perfect, right? So hypotheses are always open to change. They're always falsifiable. And remember, it's hard to bake science down into like one like step-by-step method because it's very dynamic, right? There's always this exploration and discovery aspect of science, right? New ideas can come from random places. In my experience as a scientist, is very rarely this like straight and narrow path that you're walking down like a robot, right? Like, okay, I have an idea, I test it, I prove it, yeah, like that's not how it works, right? It's very dynamic. You go down, you have like a wrong idea, but the wrong idea leads you to a better idea, et cetera, right? And another important part of science is that science is not this like solo enterprise, right? It's not this one person locked in a room by themselves thinking really hard. It's this community of people working together, right? I have had some of the best ideas I've heard have been from students. They've been from like members of the public, right? People are very creative, very curious, right? So science really benefits from this community aspect, right? Whether that be other scientists or other people, right? And that's a really, if you're interested in being a scientist, one of the great parts of being a scientist is you get to meet people from literally all over the world. And that's been one of my favorite parts of being a scientist. Now, there's this term evidence, which has come up a little bit, but in science, evidence is basically all the observations and results you have, right? These are what we call facts. These are observations of the natural world. It's unfortunate because the word fact has kind of taken on the connotation to be something that is true, whereas in the scientific context, it really just means an observation, right? Like you observe the temperature in this room is an observation, right? That's not an interpretation. It's a I can do it with my phone if I really wanted to, right? It's the temperature, right? Whereas a hypothesis is the explanation. Like what does temperature mean, right? Why do I feel sweaty when it gets hot, right? Those are hypotheses. So, a couple of important words. A fact in science is an observation that has been repeatedly confirmed, right? It is something that we find over and over and over again when we make observations of the natural world. A hypothesis is like this tentative statement that's never proven. It is either supported or rejected. Right? A hypothesis really is an explanation of the natural world. How does the natural world work? Right? That is what a hypothesis is. A theory, and this is another unfortunate thing, the word theory has become, it's interesting, right? Fact has become kind of slang for true, like that's facts, right? I hear my students say sometimes. Theory has kind of become almost like a guess or like, oh, I have a theory, like that type of thing, right? A theory in science is a highly tested, very substantiated explanation. Usually there's a large body of evidence. And critically, scientific theories are distinguished from hypotheses partly by the amount of support they have, but also partly by the fact that they explain many things, right? So, what we're going to talk about in this class is the theory of evolution, right? And sometimes people hear theory of evolution, like, what is it, just a guess? No. Evolution is an idea that life changes and has a single common ancestor, and we'll talk about that in a future lecture. That it is an idea, it's a hypothesis, really, that unites everything else we do in biology, is united by the theory of evolution, right? It is this massive, encompassing idea that spreads out across this whole field of biology, right? So a theory is not just that it's been substantiated multiple times. Theories are these theory is kind of like the framework for a building, right? It's this massive thing that connects everything else, right? Like this building I'm in has a framework, has this thing that all everything else in the building's connected to, right? And it supports everything else. That's what evolution is. Theories can be disproven, by the way. It is possible, right? They are falsifiable just like anything else. And in geosciences, we really don't deal with scientific laws, but scientific laws are the kind of the next step up, right? In biology, we really don't have laws. It's more of a physics and chemistry thing. So let's talk about fact versus theory, right? When we talk about gravity, the fact of gravity is that if I drop my wallet, for example, falls towards the center of the earth, right? It goes down, which is defined as towards the center of the earth. Fact, right? I saw that, you saw that, right? We could rewind it, rewind the clock, it goes like it goes down, right? Theory, right, is this explanation for how it works, right? The theory of gravity is the explanation for how gravity works, right? This explanation can be falsified or supported based on observation, based on math, right? Complicated physics stuff that I am not personally qualified to teach you, although I did enjoy physics in college. Not that I was that good at it. So, fact and theory of evolution, right? So, we talked about gravity. Let's get to one that's, it's funny, right? Because, like, the theory of gravity, you'd be hard pressed. I know that there are now people on the internet who will tell you that gravity isn't real somehow, but evolution is one that gets a lot of flack for whatever reason. So the fact of evolution is that we observe changes in gene frequencies and populations across generations. That's a lot of words that essentially means that living things change, right? And living things change across populations, right? Typically, right, in the same species. So, for example, the human population is currently changing. Right now, people are dying, people are being born. The makeup, the genetic makeup of the human population this morning is different than what it is now, right? Because people have been born and people have died since the beginning of the day. That's just a fact, right? You can observe this in wild animals, in humans, in bacteria, right? It's a fact. The theory of evolution is the mechanism, the explanation of how that happens, right? How does a population change, right? That is the theory of evolution. That, of course, is the focus of this class because it unites everything in biology and is fundamental to anybody who is interested not only in the biological sciences, but just in themselves, right? Where do I come from? Those kinds of questions. Very important, requires evolution to explain. So, evolution is a fact and a theory at the same time, right? You can observe evolution, right? And you can theorize about evolution, right? Really famous study. There are these little fish called sticklebacks, right? And a stickleback, this teeny tiny little fish, right? We're going to draw a great fish here. And it has all of this armor when they live in marine environments, right? They have these armored plates, they have these spines, right? And it protects them, right? What we've observed is if a stickleback population goes from a marine environment where they have predators to a freshwater environment where they no longer have predators very quickly, right, in terms of years, right? It's not instant. But what will happen is that within these populations, there are some individuals that have a genetic mutation where they have less armor, smaller spines, smaller plates. And what will happen is these individuals have an advantage when there's no predators around anymore. Because remember, bone, things like this takes energy to make, right? If you were going to make a suit of armor out of your own bone, that would take a lot of energy, right? Just like very similar to like when kids are growing, right? When you have a growth spurt, right? They eat a lot because they need that energy to grow. So You have our variant in the population that doesn't have that bony armor. They have more energy for reproduction. They can, if they're female, they can lay more eggs. If they're males, they can mate more times, right? These ones have the advantage, and relatively quickly, in a few populations, you will see the population become less armored with time, right? That is a fact. The theory, the fact is, you will see that change. That's happened multiple times. There's a whole field of research on this, right? Just on these sticklebacks, right? That's a fact. The theory is what I was saying about, oh, the different reproductive and survival success, right? That is the theory of evolution, which we're going to focus on in this class. Oh, what am I doing? Okay. So in science, we ask how, not why. This is critical, right? I think the best way I can summarize all of what we just talked about is that we ask how things happen, not why things happen, right? The why is more of a philosophical question, right? There is a lot of great why questions that you get that you can answer with things like religion, right? Why am I here? Why was I put on this earth? Why am I me? Right? Great questions for religion. Science, we ask things like, how did humans evolve? How come we have bones and teeth and jaws? Right? Things like that. That's a great scientific question. So, as evolutionary scientists, we ask how living diversity arose, right? How did human beings arise? How did these fish evolve armor or lose armor, right? How do these things happen? Not the why. And we seek to explain the diversity of life in terms of natural processes based on formulating hypotheses, right? So, opposites are formulating explanations of nature in terms of nature, and we go out into nature and we make observations of living things. That is what we're going to do. So, to summarize here, and we'll take next time. We'll go with we'll launch from like what modern evolutionary biology does. But evolutionary biology, the evolutionary perspective, aims to do a couple of things. Number one, we seek to explain all biological phenomena, which includes living things and even kind of like living things, like a virus. We'll talk about viruses are not technically alive, but they are like living things. They are, if you like complicated worms, they are a simulacrum of life. They are pseudo organisms, similar to life forms, right? We'll talk all about viruses next time. But the idea is, as evolutionary scientists, we explain living things in terms of natural mechanisms. We also say the idea of evolution, and we will talk about how this idea came to be. Like, why do we think this, right? But the idea is that evolution, the theory of evolution, is that that all living things have some descent with modification, meaning that there is some unified, basically, what's the word I'm looking for? Lineage of all living things, that over time, living things change, right? Via natural processes that we call evolution, and that we can trace those changes back into time eventually. And we'll talk about this in a future lecture, the universal common ancestor of all living things. So basically, evolution is descent, is this almost this family tree of living things with modification, right? So we have this shared natural heritage with all living things, but over time, living things change via, and we're going to learn, multiple mechanisms working in tandem. And there's a misconception, by the way, that Darwin came up with the theory of evolution. That is incorrect. The idea of evolution predates Darwin by hundreds, depending on who you talk to, thousands of years. Darwin formulated a mechanism for evolution, not the theory of evolution. And this is essential, right? And we're going to talk about in the second part of this lecture that living things are really important. We are living things. We depend on, rely upon, and sometimes are even at odds with other living things. And we need to understand them, right? To solve problems in the real world, we need to understand living things. The evolutionary perspective is living things and their characteristics can only be understood in the context of their history. What this means is to understand yourself, To understand a living thing you depend upon, let's say you're a farmer and you're raising sheep, right? Those are living things. Let's say that you are a person, you're trying to avoid a disease, right? We'll talk about diseases in the next part of this lecture. Those are also living things, right? Or like living things, like a virus. To understand those things yourself and their characteristics, you have to put them in the context of their history. Otherwise, you will make mistakes. And as we will learn, mistakes in science, if you try to use this drawing of a clock, as silly as it is, if you don't approach these things properly, you will make mistakes. You will get the wrong time. And unfortunately, in real life, when science is done wrong, people lose money and people die, right? And we're going to learn about that. Unfortunately, right? We're going to learn, you might be like evolutionary science, people dying, we'll talk about it, right? Things that there are literally millions of people who have died because of bad evolutionary science, right? We'll get to that in the history of evolutionary thought. But final thing here, right, before we end, is that evolutionary biology is an essential 21st century science because we are trying to understand living things in nature's terms, make predictions, right? Because of these parts of the evolutionary perspective. And we will start here next time. So if you've been listening, thank you very much. Hope you have a wonderful day. Hope you enjoy.